Hello, everyone. Welcome to Engagement Experts Live. I'm really excited about our guest today and our show, and more specifically, the topic, leading and coaching managers through a return to office. I've had so many conversations with leaders, executives, and HR practitioners, and I'm looking forward to really digging into this with our guests today. Based on the success of our last live session, we have stuck with this live format based on your feedback. You've told us that the most useful and engaging part of the discussion is our expert opinions and advice that our guests offered. And we have another great guest today. Before I introduce him, though, just some quick housekeeping. As you're going to see here shortly, we will be conducting another quick live poll to make our discussion more collaborative. This will also tee up the Ask Me Anything section for Nikhil, our guest. And as always, we want this to be a forum for you. So please drop questions in the Zoom meeting at any point in time. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to launch a quick poll here. And so you now should see a few questions that are all geared around your approach to returning to the office and any potential challenges that you may be experiencing. Please share your feedback. We'll come back to that later in the conversation. Right now, I'm just thrilled to introduce a guest whom I was connected through a side project, the Modern People Leader podcast, which is another project that I'm involved in where we interview various HR leaders and people leaders. You can find the Modern People Leader on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. One of our guests, Sarah Salbu Young, connected me with Nikhil Paul. And I have to say that I've been extremely impressed with Nikhil, his expertise, the teams he's worked with, and we're really excited about digging into our topic today. Welcome, Nikhil. How are you doing?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing good.
So before we jump into the conversation, let's start with a little bit about you. So why don't you share your story? Like, how did you get to where you are today? You have a pretty amazing journey. And so why don't you share like the 2-3 minute version with our audience?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you again for having me. Yeah, I came from the startup background. So after graduating from college, I trained as an engineer, but soon enough, I started jumping into software development and building startups. And so I've been a part of a couple of startups, and the one that really kind of brought me into this world of employee engagement, in some ways, I did my own employee engagement software tool. And so this is one place where you and I connect and overlap a little bit. Is 5 years ago, I was running my own Pulse survey software. And so similar to you, you learn a lot when you're meeting with these employees and these leaders and these international companies. And I got a real good sense of what motivated people, what brought them back to the companies that they worked with. And it kind of inspired me. So when I reset my career a couple of years back, I really love the challenges and the opportunities with building really high and highly engaged workforces in these top companies. And I was like, okay, how can I be a part of it in all these different great teams I've seen? And so that's what's led me to what I do today. I'm a leadership team coach. So I say that I get it on the ground floor and I get my hands dirty and I try to figure out, okay, what are the challenges? What are they going through? And just kind of help coach them through it, whether that's a workshop, or whether that's me being one-on-one with them. The idea is I've kind of lived in their shoes, so I understand. So if anything, I'm more of a morale support and giving them a little bit of clarity to help push them.
And I think we all need morale
with
what we've been going through over the last year and a half. And so you've done coaching and training for the likes of Airbnb, SalesForce, Hubspot, and some other really impressive companies. So what does that work entail? What does the training and coaching look like?
Yeah. So for me specifically, it's based on what the client is looking to do. So it could be something as simple as a one-day offsite retreat where the team is just kind of refreshing and relaunching themselves. Kind of in the literature of team psychology, it's very important that the team get a good grasp and kind of reset their intentions and their mission. So I can start with something like that to something a little bit more expansive, right? Because part of what people need is some level of accountability and a little nudge. Sometimes we get so caught up in the way we do stuff that we don't realize we're victims of our own kind of habits and our mentality. So I'll do a longer term, 3 to 6 month coaching program where I'm part of the team's meetings, part of the team's ongoing processes, and then saying, okay, why did we do that? Do we feel like we could have done that better? So it really depends on what the client or the team is looking for. But the idea is to kind of nudge them in a more positive way, and then just holding up, the scoreboard to them and saying, hey, here's what we talked about. Here's what we're actually doing. What do you think?
I love it.
So yeah.
I love it. Yeah. And one of the reasons why I invited you to join today is, when you talk about having to unwind kind of old norms, shift into new ways of operating and interacting with teams. Like we have done that once, moving from the old way of doing things to the kind of pandemic way of operating with stay at home, et cetera. And now with vaccinations and economies reopening, it feels like we're shifting back and we're going to have to unwind the I guess new norms into another way of doing things. And there's a lot of change involved in that. And I really thought that you would offer our audience a great perspective on what the leading edge companies are doing that and how to best manage that. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I have a lot of questions for you. But before we do that, I wanted to open up the quick poll and show the results. So hopefully you all can see the results now. So this is really interesting. The first question was, we completed an internal pulse survey to understand our employees' desire to return to office. 64%, this is actually lower than I thought. 64% said yes, 36% said no. With the teams that you've been working with, have you seen a degree of surveying? What have you seen there?
Yeah, usually if the team directly, the leadership team themselves, it's small enough that they feel like they can have conversations about it. It's a little bit more anecdotal. But if they're a leadership team that's part of a larger organization, yeah, they definitely employ surveys to get the results so that they can inform the meetings and the discussions they're having. So for sure.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about that, but that's definitely what we've seen. Although, our clients are more geared toward sending pulse surveys and getting employee feedback. So the next question is, what is your plan for a return to office? So this is a little more dispersed than what I thought, but it looks like the winning result is 3 days per week in the office. We have less than 10%, 6% specifically that are not, they're staying virtual. More than I thought are returning full time at 22%.
Yeah.
So interesting results there. And as far as the biggest challenges, implementing flex work arrangements is number one, followed by keeping a vibrant workplace culture and maintaining equity between in-office and remote employees. So I'm looking forward to digging into these results. Anything jump out of anything surprising you here?
No, actually, it makes total sense, right? Well, the first thing that went out the window was the sense of culture and community when we're working remotely. So I think people are desiring that, like they're eagerly waiting to kind of get back into the fold and meet people and kind of build that sense of camaraderie. So no, that makes total sense that would be the number one.
I don't know if you're familiar with Gravity Payments. Their CEO, Dan Price, is famous for a decision that they made around their comp practices a few years ago, but he posted on LinkedIn something that I thought was really a really pretty spot on approach of how to look at the return to work. And what he said was, instead of making a top-down CEO decision, you should ask your employees what they want and what they're looking for. And in their case, it was pretty clear, like what the level of return to office they were looking for. And, his comment was, this stuff isn't hard. I'm not sure it's that easy, but I like his keep it simple approach. Whether or not it should be, I'm finding that, HR teams are still struggling. Maybe we are bearing the brunt of the harder part, the nuances of the decision. And so I'm really looking forward to getting your thoughts on this. Are you ready to jump into our Q&A?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, first question for you. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing in terms of the work you do with leaders and teams on the topic of returning to office?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You start seeing patterns. Once you work with all these different types of teams, you'll start noticing patterns. And I think one of the biggest problems I've seen just across the board, it comes out in different ways, is the lack of clarity within a leadership team in terms of goals and priorities. And most people don't realize this, but like when you're the leader and you have a very strong sense of, mission, you're like, well, I've said it at meetings and I'm pretty vocal about it. I'm quite sure everyone's on the same page, but you'd be surprised how often people on your team have different interpretations of what they think is the most important. So what that leads to are people prioritizing and misaligning their efforts, right? So not everyone's pulling their weight equally on projects and tasks. And that lack of equal effort by your teammates leads to a little bit more resentment and demotivation. So that first one, lack of clarity on kind of the core focus and the priorities is the big one. The second one is lack of context in digital communication, right? So everyone kind of knows this, you've experienced this, right? All these emails, Zooms, and Slack conversations that we're having, something's still missing, right? Because whether it's a lack of full body language or the subtlety in communication, just the lack of environmental context, all of that is leading to two things. One, we're more inclined to misinterpret each other, right? So we have different expectations of what's expected. So you're like, hey, I told you to do this for me, but you didn't do it, or you only got part of it done. Or two, people are misconstruing each other's intentions, right? You're like, oh my God, Steven hates my guts, but not really. He just said no to a project I asked his help on. But what I didn't realize was that he's so busy with the other stuff, right? So intentionality and misinterpretations are two big things that makes the Zoom communication channels really hard. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing I've seen is this lack of what I call progress accountability. And what that means is that, we come from a mindset of this industrial revolution, factory, work seat mindset. So it's like butts in the seat productivity. So if I, as a leader, see you working, then I guess you must be productive. And the moment we went remote, that kind of went out the window, right? And so what do? We're like, oh my God, I have to be a better leader. I have to do something. So we overcompensate by being micromanaging, right? We start getting our nose way too into the books, or it could be the other way around. Sometimes we're afraid we're not showing people that we're productive enough, so we're working longer hours and we're answering emails at all times. And so again, this style of extreme work follow-ups leads to burnout and people just being overexerting themselves. So those three things are the biggest challenges I'm seeing: the lack of clarity, the lack of context in communication, and the lack of progress accountability.
And so as we shift to returning to the office, even more change, there's going to be disruption. How can we turn these challenges into opportunities?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So I think the return to work, the work office is going to add one more challenge that people might not realize or might already be seeing, is that it's going to all of a sudden create a little bit more tension. What's going to end up happening is a little bit of, you're going to have these people who kind of more work at home, and then the ones who work from the office. And those three problems I mentioned before, they're kind of going to get exacerbated because managers will start showing a little bit more preferential treatment to the people who are in the office, right? So for example, if we talk about that lack of clarity, all of a sudden, yeah, maybe you all still need to figure out what your core focus and goals are, but you're going to be prioritizing maybe the goals and needs of those who are in the workplace than those who aren't physically in the workplace, right? So the office employees might find their projects being fast-tracked or given more resources. Or the second one is, you might find that you're more patient with the employees who are in the office space versus the ones who are on Zoom, because you're exhausted from Zoom communication. And the last one is just, you're probably going to be giving more freedom and micromanaging the people in the workplace physically less than the ones who are remote. remotely calling in. So those three problems being exacerbated more, those are things we have to kind of be apprised of. But to answer your questions, how do we solve all this, right? How do we make sure people are turning these challenges into opportunities? The first is, I say, craft a best work story. I once a year or once every 2 quarters or once a quarter, craft a story where you say, hey, what is our best work story? And a story is very powerful because it immediately brings up feelings and emotions, and it helps people feel more interested and like you can grasp onto it. So have your team and you come up with your best work story. Like, who are you helping? How are you helping them? And what's the intended end result of the work you're doing? Whether that's for customers or stakeholders in a larger company, create a story. And just by writing a story with your team, see how people react to it. They were like, well, actually, I think we should be doing this, or no, I should be doing that. And through that process, you'll start removing kind of all this doubt, and you're going to create more clarity and say, this is what we say yes to, and these are the things we say no to. And this process of kind of refining that story and being very clear about it also gets people to emotionally buy in to the mission.
I love the idea of creating stories and celebrating the successes. It will reinforce that, you know, this new way, the future of work for your particular company is successful. Like you're already taking steps in a positive direction. It will reinforce to others, like set an example. So start to like weave this into the culture. And it will also, you know, I think as part of that is opening up, you know, a conversation for it. If it's not working, that, you know, employees can speak up. And so I think that having these stories, and it's like internal PR, right? It's marketing the new way of operating, that this is part of our culture, and you know, this can be successful. And so you know, we just got a great question, and I know I said I would save the questions for the AMA, but you know, can you give us an example of a powerful story, either that you've had? I know that this is still new in terms of, you know, returning to office, but how have, you know, you seen teams or companies be successful in taking these stories and telling the story in a way that is like not hokey and that lands well with employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, every team's story is different. And I always say stories, you can create a story, even if you're like a really remote technical team that doesn't feel like it's doing something great, you can. That's the onus on you as a leader. So for example, you can have a story where you say something very specific. So it can be like, we help Joe, the artisanal brewer down the road, speed up his marketing campaign so he can get his new beers out to our town, right? And so that story is very specific. You can kind of see that artisanal brewer. You should be able to be like, oh, that's the person we're helping. What does that tell you about the people you're helping? Well, you're helping small businesses. You're helping people who are trying to get their marketing strategy up and going, right? And so the other thing is, you can also tell, we help speed up their marketing strategy, as opposed to we do everything for them. We just help them speed up their marketing. That nuance is what I'm talking about. That's where you get into the more, and then ultimately, the end goal is that they should be able to have more access to more customers, right? And so keeping those three things in line, it helps.
Yeah, and I think the part to add from a people standpoint is, you know, who are the team members, right? We had Joe and Susie and, you know, whomever that were part of the team, and here's how, you know, here's what the contributions that each of these team members had to this success story. I think that, you know, in our experience, you know, bringing the human element is what, because people know Joe and Susie and whomever, right? They're working with these other team members, and that will give recognition, which will, you know, have, you know, recognition and kudos has such a positive effect on employee morale. And it's just an easy way of doing that. So that would be the only thing that I would add to that. And so sorry, Nikhil, I think, you know, we were still talking about opportunities when I took us down this
no worries.
getting us back on track, what other ways, can teams turn, create opportunities, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
I'll let you finish where you were going.
No, absolutely. So stories, platform agnostic, right? Whether you've got a hybrid workforce model, stories are a great way to make sure people are on top of the same mission. The second one I would say is creating a culture covenant. So again, once we move back to this hybrid workforce model, you're going to have people feeling a little bit disenfranchised, especially the ones who are working from home. And so what you want to do is ask your team to source, hey, where are we having the most friction in our communication and our meetings, okay? And still be the small things, right? Again, you don't need to solve everything. You just need to start this process. So you can start by saying, let's talk about what's the most frustrating parts of our communication. And that's when people will say things like, hey, I'm tired of every time I post something on Slack, nobody responds to me. And I feel very disempowered, like nobody cares about my contribution. So then the team will say, you know what, that's not good. That's a top priority for us. How do we solve it? Okay, from now on, anytime anyone posts something on Slack, one of us will respond in less than 2 hours. Then that becomes this new commitment, right? Whether that solves the problem or not, no. I mean, it might not, but it's the step in the right direction, right? And it's back to this idea you and I are talking about, which is increasing morale. People now have a mechanism with which to talk about the inefficiency and the inequality with the people who are at the workplace versus the people who are at home. This helps bridge that gap by creating this kind of culture covenant and everyone buying into it and saying, we're going to make it feel equitable from the way we talk and communicate with each other. So that's the second solution. I always say, create a culture covenant.
Yeah. And so this culture covenant, how do you start the process of creating this culture covenant? Like, are you, most of the companies these days are doing some sort of survey or, engagement surveys, pulse surveys. Are you actually looking at this data? Like how do you see teams come together? And, is this like a organic grassroots thing? Is this, spearheaded by HR? Like how does this typically play out?
Yeah, again, it depends on the audience, right? If it's a smaller team, part of it is letting the team talk through and talk about what their biggest issues are and then voting on it. But if you want to bring this to a larger company conversation, you have to do some sort of survey or poll where you get everyone's feedback equally without bias or with the anonymity and all of that. So that's very important. So it depends. The mechanism with which you collect that information depends on the audience. But ultimately, the process is you want to sift through and identify, I would say, your top 3 to 5 communication/cultural issues, whether that's with meetings, whether that's in the way people correspond with each other, and just vote on it. The simple act of voting on it immediately imprints our emotional signature on the issue. You feel like, okay, maybe my problem wasn't surfaced to the top, but at least I was part of the process, so this company cares about me. So that's the step you want to take. You want to get everyone on board and start volunteering their top challenges, pick the top 3 to 5, and then start brainstorming them and come up with ideas. Okay, how can we work around this? And make it very simple. Like I've worked with companies where they've had things like, don't be a jerk. Or if someone has an idea, then say yes and, right? So it's very specific kind of quirky, but also very specific to their culture type of values and behaviors that people come up with. So the idea is to be specific. The specificity makes it feel like it's more part of what you guys do, and it gives people something to hold on to and easily remember.
Love it. Yeah. And for the engagement kind of geeks out there like myself, we're seeing a lot of companies doing, most companies, as we saw to the poll, that are going to do some sort of polling for return to office have already done that. We're seeing a lot of companies do a company-wide baseline right now, and doing that before they get to the actual, executing on the return to office, to then do a follow-on check-in just to see, like, are things going well? Brilliant. Where are the disconnects in terms of kind of this new way that we're working? And so that is all I think great feedback. And so what do you think, when we talk about the biggest challenge in the return to office, I believe that we're in a new war for talent right now. There's been a lot of chatter about, in LinkedIn, in my Apple News feed, about the Great Resignation. about
Yeah.
employee morale.
Yeah.
You know, these are real things, right? Employee burnout.
Absolutely.
Some studies suggest that, you know, anywhere from 50 to 60% of the US workforce is burnt out right now. And so, you know, do you agree that we're in a fight right now to attract and retain talent? And if so, you know, what do you think some of the key things that companies should be focusing on from a manager and team perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I think most human resource leaders know that like employee retention is like the number one priority, right? I think people have so much options. The economy is good. People feel a sense of empowerment. So they always want to up level and upskill themselves. You know, in terms of how do we retain and kind of re-engage our employees, I would say let's not get into the arms race. I know there's a temptation to compete with the Googles and the Facebooks who are offering all these amazing perks. I would say the first thing to that is, listen, we're still in a very transitional period, right? The dust hasn't settled on how this hybrid office model is going to work, which side are the most companies going to lean towards and what employees want. Right now, we're reacting from kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, both from employees and managers, right? We really love as employees the flexibility and the freedom of working at home. But as managers, sometimes we are also afraid that we're not, you know, the productivity might dip low, our competitive edge might go out the window. So just relax. Everyone take a deep breath in and just relax, right? You don't need to make a policy decision right out the gate. You can kind of just take a step back and see how people calibrate and kind of recompose themselves in this new equilibrium of hybrid workforce model. People, for the most part, are pretty good at self-managing themselves, and they'll realize, okay, there are certain parts I probably need to be in the office for, and there's certain parts I can do at home. But in terms of retaining your employees, don't try to compete with the Facebooks and the Googles. You're not going to be able to match them blow for blow with all their incentives and benefits. Instead, I say focus on the fundamentals, your three big ones, right? Your mission. I cannot state this enough. I said it already with that story, but you need to have a strong mission. Try to find your SpaceX kind of Mars mission. And even if it's the most technical, dragging, kind of dreary team job, whatever you're doing, infuse what you all do with a sense of meaning and purpose. And that's on you as a leader. Try to make it something meaningful, because everyone knows this, millennials are looking for meaning. Number two, belonging, right? What was the one thing we missed when we were remotely working? We were losing community. So if you want to create a very strong community, focus on the three parts of it: creating good structure to encourage community and interaction, creating, you know, a culture where people are reinforcing each other and being open to each other. And then last, how are people problem solving, for lack of a better word? It's called heuristics, right? The way your company and your team approaches problem solving is another way to create a sense of belonging. So in each of these three parts, you can help foster more cohesion. And the last part, very important, this is probably one of the biggest reasons why people stay with the company, is development. You got to grow your potential employees and leaders. So you got to create a very specific upskilling plan. Like, put something down where they feel like they're constantly getting better at their job. They're getting new experiences. The challenges that they're doing are different and interesting. So that development part you can do. Everyone can do it. It just requires a little bit of attention to each employee's personal goals and motivations. So those are the three things: mission, belonging, and a development plan, creating a very strong development plan.
Mission, belonging, development plan. I think those are all great things. It feels like we're entering a phase where the internal comms people are going to have to start really earning their money, because so much of, you know, what we're talking about is like basic communication.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, a trend right now in the engagement space. You know, there is this trend of nudge tools or internal employee communication tools that are essentially like templatized, but they're also customizable, so that, you know, your managers, your leaders, different people within the organization are reinforcing the same, you know, the communications that matter most, to reinforce, like, as Ken is pointing out, the three kind of key human needs of autonomy, belonging, and competence.
Yeah.
And I think or your why, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we feel that a hybrid working model is going to best position us for future success. And here
Yeah.
is why that is the case. And
Yeah.
here are the stories of our teams doing great work. One of our clients is Boston Beer, and they were an organization that were built on the social aspect of working. I mean, they are they're a brewer, right? The Boston Beer Company, and Sam Adams, Angry Orchard, and all of their culture and their norms were being driven by in-office interactions that usually involve some form of drinking. Well, guess what? With COVID, that was completely, they had to redefine, what the culture norms are and the reality. And I know that there's a question around, like, how do you balance, equity for employees that, can't go back to, that can't work remotely. And, I think we can talk about that here in a second. But, what one of the things that in the Boston Beer model that they adopted was, integrating communications into all of these, these new norms that they were creating, and these new activities that they were doing virtually, or, were hybrid, or whatever it may be. And I think, we're entering an age where internal communications, employee communications, are going to become more savvy. They're definitely increasing in the importance, and this is going to need to be a muscle that all companies are really flexing. Because that's the only way that you're really going to be able to get out this new employee branding that we're talking about. Because that's really, in my mind, what this is. This is all about the employer brand and making sure your people are aware of the strengths of your brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a couple more questions. My last question is twofold, and then we're going to open it up for the AMA section. So what should leaders and managers, really be focused on? And, we talked a little bit around the three things in terms of keeping and retaining your top talent, but how do you incentivize employees to come back to the office? You talked about the finding your SpaceX Mars mission. And, are there any other recommendations that you can offer here?
Yeah, for sure. So, part of what we need to do with this is that we have to dissect what parts are best served when we're in person, because we know that creativity, brainstorming, innovation, a lot of that happens based on riffing, right? On energy. And a lot of that is in person. So you want to give people a piece of that and just give them a nudge and say, hey, look at how fun and more interesting and engaging and productive we are when we do these parts of it. So first thing, you got to parse it out. You can't just saying right out the door, or we're going to do a blanket statement of everyone coming back. Of course, you can do that, right? If you're the CEO or the leader of the company, you can make that statement and everyone will come, whether it's begrudgingly or not. But if you can kind of parse it out and explain to them, hey, here are some of the benefits, here are what are the things we're going to try doing, and keep an open mind. And again, this is part of the value system you're making with your employees. You're trying to be open and transparent and say, here's what we know is working. Here's what we are hearing from the surveys. How about we find something that's a good hybrid model that works best? And so that conversation, so there's two parts, like I said. The first part is giving them incentives, showing them the benefits of where working from the office is actually beneficial. And then the second part is having that open conversation with them and saying, here's what we know, what people are saying, here's what we're going to try. Let's see what happens with this. Not making it permanent, not keeping it stasis, making it an open conversation. So those two things will really help. And employees feel like, okay, let's try this out. There's definitely some benefit to this. I want to see where this goes as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. And, from my perspective, I think it's important that companies like choose an edge, right? And I think the worst place to be is like in the middle and not clearly defined. And, choosing an edge that is leaning in one direction or another, and then, being clear about why, where the flexibility remains. So if the edge is like, our business relies on collaboration and creativity, and because of that, we are implementing this approach and we're creating these collaborative spaces and yada, yada, yada. I think by like choosing your edge, whether it's leaning more digital or leaning more in office, it begins, you at least give structure and clarity, and then you start to understand, where the outliers, because there's going to be outliers in every company. Yep. And so, but at least you are being perceived as being transparent. You're being, perceived as being, clear with what the plan is. And then it's a matter of like, quickly addressing some of the outlying situations. And I think, but to your point, if you've dissected, the, I guess, intention behind going back to the office, and you can be really clear about why you're doing this as a business, I think then you, defining the why, to Donna's question, it becomes easier to tell the why. Yeah. And so I want to stop there. We typically want to give 20 minutes for the Q&A process, and it never ceases to amaze me how quickly we just breeze through time. And so, opening up the Q&A, we already have some questions. We have an anonymous question here. How can we as HR professionals bridge the gap between leaderships who want to return on a hybrid 3-day model and those employees that want to stay, working from home, permanently? And this is a great question. And I think that, I would be curious from the participants to, to share like how you guys are managing this. But in my view, this is part of, there's a lot of talk about a great resignation. And, I think, there is a big risk right now between the companies that are demanding that employees work. Like for today, for example, Apple announced that their edge is you are returning. And, we will require an executive level approval for anyone that wants to have a, work from home arrangement. And that's the edge that they've chosen. And so the pendulum swung back, even though they had a record year last year in terms of sales and all metrics of their business. They, what they're hanging behind is collaboration and innovation and creativity all has to happen in the office. And so, that obviously is an extreme, but I think, there is going to be a propensity for more and more companies to do that. And so, in some of the things that I've seen is that being very clear about the scenarios in which people can work from home and, having a clear policy. There's a lot of great resources that you can find from some of the pioneering companies that, were the first kind of digital first companies out there. But, I think a lot of it's going to come down to, your leadership's, the decision-making, the criteria, for why you need to return to office, and really having clear parameters for, if there is flexibility and, if there is, when that can be, approved and not approved. Any thoughts there, Nikhil?
Yeah, I think it speaks to a lot of the stuff we were talking about before, right? I think from a leadership standpoint, okay, so as an HR professional, you're kind of in the middle ground, right? You're wrestling priority set from the top by leaders, and at the same time, you want to manage expectations of the people who work in that company, right? And so because you're in that middle ground, the best thing we can do as HR professionals is to be open conversation, keep the dialogue going and get people to keep conversing. As long as people feel like they're being heard and being seen, they're going to show up, right? And that's, at least from an HR perspective, that's what we want to do. We want to make people feel heard and seen. So that's the first step. And as you start bringing in their kind of needs and demands and leadership's needs and demands and trying to find that happy medium, the whole time it should be an ongoing process. Just keep people open to the idea that this is something we're iterating and learning as we're going through. This is unprecedented times. So have patience on both sides and let's try to figure out what's the best way to make it happen. Because look, leaders are also not fools, right? If you put too stringent of a demand, you can be an Apple and call people to come back because you're Apple, right? People are lining up to work at Apple. But if you're still an up and coming company, you want to balance the necessity versus also the brand you're trying to build as well, and try to build a good brand. So people will work with the expectations and the incentives that are playing around them. So as an HR professional, you want to manage both and bring them to a happy medium and keep that conversation going.
Love it. Next question is from Ken Bascom. Thanks first, Ken. Thanks for all your contributions in the chat. The question is, how do you manage employee resentments when some people are able to work remotely, but many cannot? This is a healthcare organization where clinical staff have to be on site to provide care, but support services like HR, finance, education can work from home. Like that's a great question, Ken. And I mean, the fact of the matter is that, bank tellers, aren't going to become a work from home a job, with this situation. I think there are a lot of jobs that are unique and, require you being in staff. In many cases, those jobs were not impacted, right? Employees had to stay in the office. And so some of the things that we see, and then I'll open it up to you, Nikhil, is having an internal, like a digital suggestion tool, so that your employees can have a forum to voice kind of the resentment. And many times, to Nikhil's point, employees want to be heard. They just want to they need an outlet for the frustration. They know that the nature of their job, if they were to leave, that they're still going to have to, have, if they're an on-site clinical staff practitioner, they're still going to have to be on site, regardless of, who the employer is. But many times, it's when, in my experience, that the resentments when they build to the point and they boil over and they explode, it's because employees don't have an outlet to be heard, and they don't have an outlet to voice resentments. And I think some form of, anonymous suggestion tool, a digital, like a tool that's more, in line with what, a modern workforce would be looking to provide feedback through, is one way of giving your employees a voice to be heard, and to manage that through a one-on-one dialogue with those specific people. I don't know, Nikhil, if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. People want to make people feel heard, right? And so that employee survey is super critical. The second thing I would say to that is make them also feel special, right? Just like frontline workers who are kind of bearing the brunt of, like, even during COVID, they were out there doing things. You want to make those people feel special for the sacrifice they're making, right? And so not necessarily give them preferential treatment, but you want to elevate them and motivate them and say, hey, thank you so much, and recognize them, right? People want to feel recognized, that they're the ones showing up, putting up with an hour's worth of traffic and missing their kid's soccer game for all the, you want to make them feel special as well. And so as a company, you want to say, hey, thank you for those people who need to be at the front and have no choice about it. And we're not saying there's one right or wrong way, but we need them. And so because of that, we celebrate them. So make sure to celebrate them and recognize them as well as part of that ongoing.
Right. Maybe there's a kudos or a recognition pillar or program specifically for those that you can brand specifically to the people that have to work on site, just to kind of create a unique way of celebrating the work that those particular employees are doing. That I love the thought of recognition. Again, we talked about how powerful recognition can be. We have a question from Penny. Penny, I don't want to mispronounce your last name, but Penny's question is, what is the most effective way to communicate the action plan realized after the internal surveys? So if I understand the question, I think it's once you have data in terms of, return to office or just, pulse, survey and data in general related to, these topics, how do you communicate, the action plan and cascade that information throughout the company? Any thoughts there, Nikhil, on what you've seen as a best practice?
Yeah, I think having been in this world a little bit, I think the first thing is be transparent and do it right away. So often, I think people lose momentum when a survey is done, and then they don't hear about it for 6 months. By then, it doesn't matter. Nobody is able to connect the dots, right? So do it, be transparent, do it right away, and you know, get highlight the top three most important things. People are very busy. So highlight, here are the top three things that we need to work on, and here are the top three things we are going to do as a result of those things. So being very specific, very clear, don't overpromise. This is something where you want to try to do kind of what would be the least amount of work that would the company most realistically could do. So again, keeping promises that you can keep. But yeah, transparent, follow up with it right away, and come up with three actionable points.
Yeah, and one of the communication techniques that we have seen be really, really successful is this is, we've heard you, this is what we've heard from you, and this is what we're doing, right? So reinforcing that you've heard the feedback and that factors into the action that you're taking. So often, I've seen companies, say, this is what we're doing. Like all employees get is the action plan. And, what is lost in there is, why that is the right course of action, or how the employee's feedback played into the action that's being taken. And that doesn't mean that you can only communicate action that came from employee feedback. That is, in the spirit of transparency, you should be having conversations around action that you're taking that doesn't align with feedback, and reinforce why you're doing that. That goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier. So a question from Stanley Han. There's a lot of chatter about the Great Resignation. How much should this weigh in on our thought process when deciding what the future of the workplace looks like? Stanley, that is a great question. Nikhil, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think about it the same way when I had a startup, when they would say, how much do you worry about the competition? Yes, to a certain degree, you should know about ongoing trends. But at the end of the day, if your product is good, and in this case, the product is the employee experience is good, and you have a strong culture and you worked on the fundamentals, let the chips fall as they may, right? Because people who are, and this is the thing I think about with branding as well, you want people who are passionate about your company. If people are kind of on the feeling wishy-washy about it, then maybe it's better for you that they're gone. Maybe immediately you won't like it, but in the long term, you want people who are committed to the cause, because they're going to show up as happier, more open, more flexible, more resilient employees. So, and obviously more productive. So yeah, I think to a certain extent, you should know about it and be apprised of what's happening in the marketplace from a hiring perspective. But at the end of the day, focus on your fundamentals with your culture and your team and your community in the company.
Yeah, I have two views, largely in line with what you just shared, Nikhil. I think I have a hypothesis that we're entering a new labor or new workforce, and we may find that it's a dual kind of labor pool, and there are those who prefer to work in the office and are going to, an Apple is really going to appeal to them because, they fundamentally want to be in the office. And there's the emerging, remote workforce, and they're going to, a company that is like choosing the edge of digital first, they are going to, have a much, a better chance of retaining and attracting, this new emerging kind of workforce. That is just my hypothesis. And so I think first, like choosing the edge, right, is gonna play heavily, and really doubling down on your employee branding, your campaigning, whether it's through LinkedIn, whether, it's through built-in, like whatever tools you're using to market your employer brand. I think this is the winners are going to be the ones who are savvy and know how important employer branding is, and are really out there, not scared that they're choosing the wrong side, but they're out there, really putting a stake in the ground around what the future looks like for insert your company name. So I think, from that perspective, we all have to think about the Great Resignation. I think the fact of the matter is that there's going to be churn, and a lot of it's going to be, uncontrollable. We can't control that, there is a segment of employees that are no longer interested in sales jobs and may want to go work as a park ranger, whatever it may be. Like that, you're going to see that. And that's, I really love what you were sharing, Nikhil, in terms of focusing in the fundamentals of your employee experience and your data. So this is where critical numbers in your engagement and pulse surveying are really, really important, because you're going to be able to see if you have one or two kind of critical numbers, whether it's ENPS, it's employee satisfaction, whatever that, employee advocacy, whatever that number is for you, really keeping a track of that is going to tell you, like, should you be, somewhat concerned about the Great Resignation, or do you have a major issue on your hands? Next question, and we're at the 10 minutes or less, so I'm going to try to speed this up. They keep rolling in. Anonymous attendee, when leadership has been silent for a very long time, even though asking employees to give feedback, how can HR convince people that something will change? Wow. So it sounds like leadership is still deliberating. They haven't chosen the edge. So what do you do when your leadership team hasn't chosen an edge, right, or doesn't have a clear plan? As practitioners, in the people space, how do we reassure our people?
Yeah, that's a tough one. This is something I think a lot of HR leaders face in some way, right? If you don't have a decision seat, if you don't have a seat at the decision table, so to speak, then it's going to be very tough for you to convince the people who are in your company that there's change coming, or there's going to be some sort of impact on their work life, especially when there hasn't been from the top down. So again, if you can't speak to something, and obviously the first thing, don't make promises you can't keep, right? So whatever trust that you may have will then go right out the window. You wanna hold your cards close and be very certain. If you're going to make promises, be absolutely clear and transparent about what's actually possible. And just say where the progress is. We're still working on things. We're still trying to figure things out, because as an HR leader, that's your job. Your job is to maintain the composure of that company's culture and the people. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, you can find other ways to increase morale. You can find other ways to get people, like, you can work within the constraints and within the limitations that you're working at, and come up with creative ideas to get employees to feel like there's progress being made, right? So maybe we don't know what the exact new protocol will be, but maybe you can start with a small project, or like a small pilot program, to kind of work within the constraints and try different things. So again, try to focus on things you can control, and things you can't control, you can be honest about it and say what you do know. But don't need to overpromise and just try to deliver something you never will be able to do. Because once you do that, then people will stop trusting you, and you want to always have your people's trust.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to what Nikhil just shared. If you are a surveying organization, meaning you're conducting pulse surveys, you're sending these out on a fairly frequent basis, you may want to add a retention question to your pulse survey. So I plan on staying at company name for 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6, 12, 1 to 2 years, whatever those options may be, and identifying whether, there is a real retention. That's a lagging indicator, whether there's a real retention risk at your company, because that's data that your leadership team needs to see to make a decision, right?
Yeah.
They need to quit being silent and start taking action. Like, the time is now. And so anything you can do to get data, that's, to me, data is like the one language that all leaders speak or should speak. And so something else to consider there.
Absolutely.
Anonymous attendee, another anonymous attendee, a percentage of our team is physically remote, out of state, will continue to be when we return to the office. Would you consider it preferential treatment to offer perks in person, but not extend them to those who will be working remotely, i.e. offer lunch in the office, but not offer lunch option to those out of state? I think this is the broader question of equity and bias in
Yeah.
the workplace and a new realm of challenges that we're going to face. Thoughts there, Nikhil?
Yeah, again, look, if it feels a little unfair, use your kindergarten manners, right? Like if it feels like you're disinviting someone to your party, then you most likely are, right? Obviously, I can't speak for each company's policies and why they do what things, but yeah, no, if I were to react directly from that comment, in today's day and age, there are 100 different ways you can make the out of work employees have some level of lunches paid for them or meals paid for them. There should not be an excuse that you can't, whatever you're doing for the in-house employees, you should also be doing it for the out-of-house employees as well, in some measure, right? It doesn't have to be A for A. It just has to make me feel valued. Like you just thought about me and make me feel like you're intentionally trying to do something to make me feel valued as well. So yeah, no, I would say you should do that. Otherwise, people will start feeling a little out of touch.
Yeah, and I'm mixed on this one. I think it's hard. There is a benefit. There are like unspoken benefits that a remote worker is getting, right? By not having to commute, by having, more flexibility in terms of how I integrate my personal, life activities into like my work day. And so how do you balance that out, right? For the people that are going into the office, maybe we need to have a group discussion on that. But I'm kind of torn on that one. Just a couple more questions before we have to wrap it up. We have two in our chat line from Diane Kenyon. Hi, Diane. Glad you were able to join us. It sounds like there are a lot of unknowns on the return to office and how you help the folks that are uncomfortable with not knowing that they may leave for the virtual work from home guarantee. I'm not sure if this is a statement or a question. I think this is a statement. I think there are folks that are uncomfortable with the uncertainty, kind of like the anonymous question we had earlier, that are going to leave, right? Yeah. Again, if there's this new, in my mind, and our data is showing that there is this new workforce, this virtual workforce that is emerging, and they are going to leave if you do not have a clear plan, or it's not it's not remote enough, then flexible enough, then I think there is a risk that these people are going to leave, and I'm not sure that that's something that companies are going to be able to control if their policies don't align with the new demands of the virtual labor force. I don't know what your thoughts are there, Nikhil.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's too much to add to that. You have to be cognizant that this is still, the dust hasn't settled. Just be open and let people know that this is still an area where we're not fully sure which way we're going to go. And that's the honest truth. You will change to the market conditions. If a lot of your employees start leaving, guess what? Your return to the office policy, that might also start changing because you're losing talent. So yeah, be honest and say, hey, this is why we need it. Like we talked about before, these are the benefits if you come work in our office. But let's see where it goes. It's an ongoing conversation. And like to your point, those pulse surveys are going to keep you informed on the daily to see which way the wind is blowing. So yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, we're about out of time. There's the last question that we have here in the chat is, do you have any sample culture covenants that you can share? Part of what I'm going to do is share your contact information, Nikhil, with everyone that has attended today. We're going to share the recording of today's session, and we can share your contact information so that you can share what examples are of samples of culture covenants, because I know that you have some specific views into what those look like. I just wanted to wrap up by saying thank you everyone for joining today's session of our Engagement Experts Live. Nikhil, you're amazing. Thank you so much. I love the work you do. I hope you can come back and join us again sometime.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you.